Three blasts of a shotgun. When silence returned, Dorothy Stratten, the most beautiful woman in America, was gone. August 14th, 1980. Inside a modest apartment on Clarkson Road, West Los Angeles, the afternoon sun filtered through cheap Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across a scene of unimaginable horror. The air hung thick with cordite and the metallic stench of blood. Dorothy Ruth Stratten, just 20 years old, lay motionless on the bedroom floor. The golden-haired goddess who had graced magazine covers worldwide, now reduced to silence in a spreading crimson pool. The official report would later state it plainly. Murder-suicide. Paul Snider, her estranged husband and the man who had discovered her beauty, had used a 12-gauge shotgun to end both their lives. But in those first moments, as police photographers captured the devastating scene, questions began to emerge that would haunt Hollywood for decades. Why had Dorothy returned to the apartment she had been avoiding? Who was the mysterious caller who had contacted her that morning? And most chilling of all, had Paul Snider acted alone, or was there something far more sinister orchestrating this tragedy? The evidence would paint a picture of obsession, control, and jealousy taken to its most lethal extreme. But those who knew Dorothy whispered of other forces at play. Powerful men who had used her innocence as currency, an industry that devoured its most vulnerable stars, and a culture that transformed young women into objects of desire while offering them no protection from the predators it attracted. Her nude body, positioned with deliberate cruelty, would become the final image of a woman whose life had been scripted by others from the very beginning. The Playmate of the year 1980, the rising starlet handpicked by legendary director Peter Bogdanovich, the Canadian small-town girl who had dreamed of love and family. All of these identities converged in that blood-soaked room where Hollywood's darkest impulses had finally claimed their prize. The world mourned the loss of what they called the most beautiful woman in America, but they mourned a fantasy, an image carefully constructed by magazine photographers and studio publicists. The real Dorothy, vulnerable, lonely, trapped between the competing obsessions of the men who claimed to love her, had been crying out for help in letters and phone calls that would only be discovered after it was too late. Was this really the tragic end of a love story gone wrong, as the headline suggested? Or had Dorothy Stratten become the sacrificial lamb in a much larger game, one where powerful men traded in young women's dreams and disposed of them when they became inconvenient? The answers lay buried in the shadows of an industry built on illusion, where the line between fantasy and nightmare had always been dangerously thin. But to understand how it all ended in that blood-soaked apartment, we must first understand how it all began, in the most unlikely of places with the most innocent of dreams. Vancouver, British Columbia, 1978. The city's gray skies seemed to stretch endlessly over the modest neighborhoods where dreams were luxuries most families couldn't afford. In a small apartment in East Vancouver, 18-year-old Dorothy Ruth Stratten was living a life that bore no resemblance to the glamorous destiny that awaited her. Working behind the counter at a Dairy Queen, she served ice cream to customers with the same gentle smile that would later grace magazine covers around the world. Dorothy had been born into struggle. Her Dutch immigrant parents, Simon and Nellie Stratten, had divorced when she was young, leaving her mother to raise Dorothy and her younger sister Louise on a secretary's modest salary. The family moved frequently, never quite finding stability in their new country. Dorothy learned early that beauty could be both a blessing and a burden. Boys at school noticed her, but their attention often came with complications she was too young to fully understand. Those who knew her in those early days described a girl who seemed almost otherworldly in her innocence. While her classmates were experimenting with rebellion and pushing boundaries, Dorothy remained focused on simpler dreams. She wanted to be loved, to have a family, to find stability that had always eluded her childhood. She was tall for her age, with naturally blonde hair and features that photographers would later describe as classically perfect, but she seemed unaware of her effect on others. The signs were there even then of a young woman who would struggle with the weight of other people's expectations. Dorothy was eager to please, quick to apologize, and uncomfortable with attention even as her beauty made her impossible to ignore. She had learned to be grateful for small kindnesses, a trait that would make her vulnerable to those who would later exploit her generosity. At the Dairy Queen, she was known for her genuine warmth with customers, especially children and elderly patrons who seemed drawn to her natural empathy. She saved every penny she could, sending money home to help her mother and dreaming of a day when she might be able to provide real security for her family. The irony was bitter. Dorothy's desire to help those she loved would eventually lead her into the hands of a man who would destroy her. Could anyone have predicted, watching this gentle teenager serve ice cream with such earnest dedication, that she was destined to become one of the most recognizable faces in America? Or were the very qualities that made her special, her trusting nature, her desire to please, her hunger for love and security, the same traits that would seal her fate? In early 1978, everything changed with the arrival of a stranger. Paul Leslie Snider was 26 years old, a small-time promoter and hustler who fancied himself a player in Vancouver's underground scene. He dressed in flashy clothes, drove expensive cars he couldn't afford, and possessed the kind of aggressive charm that made some women uncomfortable and others fatally attracted. When he walked into the Dairy Queen that February day, Dorothy was behind the counter, and her life's trajectory shifted in ways she could never have imagined. Snider was immediately captivated by Dorothy's beauty. But more than that, he recognized something that others might have missed, an innocence that could be marketed, shaped, and ultimately monetized. He began returning to the ice cream shop daily, spending hours talking to Dorothy about dreams and possibilities she had never dared to consider. He spoke of Hollywood, of fame, of a world where a girl like her could have anything she wanted. For Dorothy, Snider represented everything she had been missing: confidence, experience, and most seductively the promise of escape from the financial struggles that had defined her family's life. He was older, worldly, and seemed to possess the kind of certainty about the future that she desperately wanted to believe in. When he suggested that she had the potential to be a model, perhaps even a star, Dorothy found herself caught between skepticism and hope. The transformation began slowly. Snider convinced Dorothy to pose for amateur photographs, claiming he wanted to help her build a portfolio. The sessions were innocent at first, simple portraits that highlighted her natural beauty. But Snider had bigger plans, and he was skilled at gradually pushing boundaries, making each new request seem like a natural progression from the last. Within months, Dorothy had moved in with Snider, abandoning her job at the Dairy Queen and allowing him to become her manager, photographer, and the architect of her future. He convinced her to change her name from the Dutch Stratten to the more American-sounding Stratten, a small alteration that symbolized how completely he was reshaping her identity. The professional photographs that Snider commissioned became increasingly provocative, and Dorothy found herself posing for images that made her deeply uncomfortable. But Snider was persuasive, arguing that this was simply the price of success, that every major star had to start somewhere. He isolated her from friends and family, convincing her that only he truly understood her potential, and that others would hold her back out of jealousy. Was Dorothy a willing participant in her own transformation? Or was she a naive teenager being systematically groomed by a predator who understood exactly how to exploit her vulnerabilities? The answer would remain complicated throughout her short life. Those who knew her described a young woman torn between her natural modesty and her desire to please the man who promised to make all her dreams come true. By late 1978, Snider was ready to make his move. He had been researching Playboy magazine's submission process and believed he had discovered a goldmine in Dorothy's combination of beauty and innocence. Without fully explaining what he was doing, he sent several of Dorothy's most revealing photographs to Playboy's headquarters in Los Angeles, along with an application for her to become a Playmate. The response was swift and overwhelming. Playboy editors were captivated by Dorothy's look. She possessed the girl-next-door appeal that the magazine's founder Hugh Hefner particularly prized, combined with a natural sensuality that couldn't be manufactured. They wanted to meet her immediately. For Dorothy, the news was both thrilling and terrifying. She had grown up seeing Playboy as something forbidden, slightly dangerous, and completely outside her conservative upbringing. But Snider painted it as the opportunity of a lifetime, the gateway to a world of wealth and fame that could solve all their problems. He convinced her that this was their chance to escape the limitations of their current life and build something extraordinary together. The decision to pursue Playboy would prove to be the moment when Dorothy's fate was sealed. She was stepping into an industry that consumed young women, managed by a man whose obsession with controlling her would eventually turn deadly, and entering a world where her innocence would be both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. As they prepared to travel to Los Angeles for Dorothy's first Playboy photo shoot, neither she nor Snider could have anticipated the forces they were about to unleash. Dorothy saw it as the beginning of their shared adventure. Snider saw it as his ticket to wealth and status. Neither of them understood that they were walking into a web of competing interests and powerful men who would view Dorothy not as a person, but as a commodity to be bought, sold, and ultimately discarded when she became inconvenient. The plane touched down in Los Angeles on a perfect California day in 1979, carrying with it a young woman whose beauty would soon captivate a nation and whose tragic fate would become one of Hollywood's most haunting cautionary tales. Los Angeles, 1979. The city of dreams welcomed Dorothy Stratten with open arms and hidden daggers. From the moment she stepped off the plane at LAX, she found herself in a world that operated by rules she had never imagined. Playboy Mansion parties, photo shoots with world-renowned photographers, and meetings with entertainment industry executives who spoke casually of million-dollar careers. It was intoxicating and overwhelming for a girl who had been scooping ice cream just months earlier. Hugh Hefner, the legendary founder of Playboy, took an immediate personal interest in Dorothy. At 53, he had perfected the art of identifying and cultivating the kind of beauty that would define American sexual fantasy. Dorothy possessed something special, an authentic innocence that couldn't be faked, combined with the kind of natural sensuality that made grown men forget their own names. Hefner began grooming her personally, inviting her to private parties at the mansion, and introducing her to the rarefied world of celebrity and privilege. The photo shoots for Playboy were unlike anything Dorothy had experienced. Professional photographers, elaborate sets, teams of stylists and makeup artists, all focused entirely on capturing and enhancing her beauty. The resulting images were breathtaking, portraying Dorothy as the embodiment of American femininity. When her centerfold was published in August 1979, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Playboy had discovered its newest sensation, but success in Playboy was only the beginning. Hollywood agents began calling, movie producers expressed interest, and Dorothy found herself being courted by some of the entertainment industry's most powerful figures. The shy girl from Vancouver was transforming before everyone's eyes into a confident, sophisticated woman who could command attention in any room she entered. The pinnacle came in 1980 when Dorothy was named Playboy's Playmate of the Year, an honor that came with a $200,000 prize and guaranteed her place in the magazine's history. The ceremony was a glittering celebration of her beauty and success, attended by celebrities and industry titans who all wanted to be associated with Playboy's newest star. Yet even at the height of her fame, those closest to Dorothy noticed troubling signs. The constant attention was exhausting, and she often expressed feeling like she was living someone else's life. In private moments, she would confess to friends that she missed the simplicity of her old life, that she sometimes felt like a beautiful bird trapped in a golden cage. Paul Snider, meanwhile, was basking in reflected glory but growing increasingly frustrated by his limited role in Dorothy's success. He had expected to become a major player in Hollywood by virtue of his relationship with Dorothy, but industry insiders viewed him as an unsophisticated hanger-on. His attempts to insert himself into Dorothy's career decisions were met with polite dismissal by her new representatives, who saw him as a liability rather than an asset. The tension was exacerbated by Dorothy's growing independence. As she became more comfortable in her new world, she began making decisions without consulting Snider, forming relationships with industry professionals who explicitly excluded him from their plans for her future. The dynamic that had once made their relationship work, his experience and her naivety, was shifting as Dorothy gained confidence and sophistication. Behind all the glamour, Dorothy was dealing with pressures that would have challenged even the most experienced performer. She was constantly being photographed, scrutinized, and judged. Every public appearance was analyzed by the media, every relationship was fodder for gossip columnists, and every mistake was magnified and dissected by a public that had elevated her to goddess status. The irony was bitter. Dorothy had achieved everything that millions of young women dreamed of: fame, wealth, beauty, and the adoration of strangers around the world. She had transcended her humble beginnings to become a cultural icon. Yet she often told friends that she felt more isolated and vulnerable than she ever had serving ice cream in Vancouver. Behind all that glamour and success was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. The question would haunt those who knew her as they watched Dorothy navigate a world that celebrated her image while remaining largely indifferent to her humanity. The cracks in Dorothy's perfect facade began showing in late 1979. Just as her star was reaching its zenith. The pressures of constant public scrutiny combined with Snider's increasingly possessive behavior were taking their toll on her mental and emotional well-being. She began suffering from anxiety attacks and insomnia, often calling friends in the middle of the night just to hear a familiar voice. More troubling were the reports from those who worked closely with her. Photographers noticed that Dorothy would sometimes break down in tears during shoots for no apparent reason. Makeup artists observed bruises that she explained away as clumsiness. Friends began receiving strange phone calls from Dorothy, conversations that would abruptly end when it sounded like someone had entered the room. The breaking point came in early 1980 when Dorothy met Peter Bogdanovich. Peter Bogdanovich was Hollywood royalty. A critically acclaimed director whose films like The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon had defined a generation of American cinema. At 41, he was sophisticated, intellectual, and possessed the kind of artistic credibility that money couldn't buy. When he cast Dorothy in his film They All Laughed, it represented her transition from sex symbol to serious actress, the validation she had been seeking since arriving in Hollywood. But their professional relationship quickly evolved into something much more complicated. Bogdanovich was captivated not just by Dorothy's beauty, but by her intelligence and sensitivity. He saw in her the potential for greatness that went beyond her Playboy fame. For Dorothy, Bogdanovich represented everything that Paul Snider was not: cultured, respected, and genuinely interested in her growth as a person and artist. Their affair began during filming and quickly became serious. Dorothy found herself torn between two worlds: the crude, possessive love of Paul Snider, who had discovered her and felt entitled to control her future, and the sophisticated, nurturing relationship with Bogdanovich, who promised to help her realize her artistic potential. The situation became increasingly dangerous as Snider realized he was losing his grip on Dorothy. His behavior grew more erratic and threatening. He hired private investigators to follow her, made late-night phone calls to intimidate her friends, and began spreading rumors about her relationship with Bogdanovich in an attempt to damage her reputation. Dorothy's friends from this period describe a young woman living in constant fear. She changed her phone number multiple times, varied her daily routines to avoid being followed, and began asking friends to accompany her to public places because she was afraid to be alone. In letters that would later be discovered, she wrote about feeling trapped between her loyalty to the man who had made her and her love for the man who truly understood her. The industry that had celebrated Dorothy's rise to stardom proved largely indifferent to her personal struggles. Studio executives and magazine publishers were concerned about their investments and insurance policies, but few showed genuine concern for Dorothy's well-being. She was a valuable commodity, and commodities were expected to perform regardless of personal difficulties. In the spring of 1980, Dorothy made the brave decision to separate from Snider and move in with Bogdanovich. It was a choice that required tremendous courage, as she knew it would likely provoke Snider to even more extreme behavior. She began divorce proceedings and started building a new life with a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty. For a brief moment, it seemed like Dorothy might escape the trap that had been closing around her since that first day Snider walked into the Dairy Queen. She was building a serious acting career, developing genuine relationships based on mutual respect, and beginning to understand her own worth beyond her physical appearance. But Paul Snider was not prepared to let her go. His obsession had transformed from love into something much darker, and he was beginning to formulate plans that would ensure that if he couldn't have Dorothy, no one else would either. Did this separation mark Dorothy's path to freedom? Or was it simply the trigger that would set her final tragedy in motion? Those who knew both Dorothy and Snider during this period would later say they sensed violence in the air. But no one could have predicted the horrific extremes to which his obsession would ultimately lead. The summer of 1980 should have been the happiest time of Dorothy's life. Her separation from Paul Snider had been finalized. Her relationship with Peter Bogdanovich was deepening into something that felt like genuine partnership, and her acting career was gaining momentum with each new project. She had moved into Bogdanovich's elegant Bel Air home, where she was finally experiencing the kind of sophisticated lifestyle that matched her public image. But freedom came with its own psychological challenges. Dorothy had spent the formative years of her adult life under Snider's control, and learning to make independent decisions was more difficult than she had anticipated. She suffered from what would now be recognized as symptoms of psychological abuse, second-guessing herself, feeling guilty about her happiness, and experiencing panic attacks when faced with choices that should have been simple. Bogdanovich, to his credit, was patient and supportive as Dorothy worked through these issues. He encouraged her to pursue therapy, to reconnect with friends she had lost during her relationship with Snider, and to explore creative interests beyond modeling and acting. Under his influence, Dorothy began reading literature, studying art, and developing the intellectual confidence to match her physical beauty. The transformation was remarkable to those who witnessed it. Dorothy began expressing opinions about her career, pushing back against photographers and directors who wanted to exploit her sexuality, and making decisions based on her own artistic instincts rather than others' expectations. She was becoming the woman she had always had the potential to be, free from the constraints that had been placed on her by men who saw her primarily as an object. But even as Dorothy was building a new life, Paul Snider's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Divorced from his primary source of income and status, he was spiraling into financial and emotional desperation. He had mortgaged his future on his ability to control Dorothy's career, and her escape had left him facing bankruptcy and irrelevance. Private investigators hired by Dorothy's lawyers reported that Snider was spending his days obsessing over her new relationship, collecting photographs and articles about her life with Bogdanovich, and making increasingly violent threats against both of them. He had purchased firearms and was frequenting bars where he would drink heavily and rant about Dorothy's betrayal to anyone who would listen. Friends and family members who encountered Snider during this period described a man who seemed to be losing his grip on reality. He would alternate between grandiose fantasies about winning Dorothy back and dark threats about what he would do if she continued to reject him. The charming hustler who had once swept Dorothy off her feet had been replaced by something much more sinister. Dorothy, meanwhile, was trying to live normally while taking reasonable precautions for her safety. She had changed her phone numbers, varied her schedules, and informed security at various studios about Snider's threats. But she was also determined not to live in constant fear, believing that if she showed she was happy and moving forward with her life, Snider would eventually accept reality and find someone else to obsess over. The psychological toll was evident to those closest to her. Dorothy would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she had heard Snider's voice or seen his car outside. She installed additional locks on doors and windows, carried pepper spray, and asked friends to call her at predetermined times to ensure her safety. In her private writings from this period, Dorothy expressed a complex mixture of emotions. She was grateful for her new life, but haunted by guilt about leaving Snider in such desperate circumstances. She worried that her success had come at the cost of another person's well-being, even though that person had been systematically abusing and controlling her for years. The tragedy of Dorothy's situation was that her empathy, one of her most beautiful qualities, was being turned against her. Even as she tried to build a healthy relationship and establish independence, she felt responsible for the man who had exploited her kindness and was now threatening to destroy her. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Dorothy, the question was becoming increasingly urgent as summer turned toward what would be the final act of her short life. She was learning that freedom was more complicated than simply walking away, and that some obsessions could only be resolved through the most extreme measures. By August 1980, Dorothy had achieved a kind of peace she had never known before. Her relationship with Bogdanovich had evolved into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared creative interests. She was developing as an actress, exploring roles that challenged her beyond her Playboy image, and beginning to imagine a future where she would be known for her talent rather than just her beauty. The legal aspects of her separation from Snider were nearly complete. Divorce papers had been filed, financial arrangements were being negotiated, and Dorothy's lawyers were confident that she would soon be completely free from her past. She had even begun discussing the possibility of starting a family with Bogdanovich, something she had dreamed about since her teenage years in Vancouver. But Paul Snider was far from finished with Dorothy Stratten. As August 14th dawned in Los Angeles, Dorothy was preparing for what should have been a routine business meeting. She had agreed to see Snider at his apartment to finalize some remaining details of their separation and to discuss the division of property that had been purchased during their relationship. Her lawyers had advised against meeting with him privately, but Dorothy felt that she owed him this final conversation, a chance to end their relationship with some dignity and tact. Friends who spoke with Dorothy that morning described her as nervous but determined to close this chapter of her life once and for all. She had dressed carefully in a simple, conservative outfit that conveyed respect without intimacy. She carried with her a folder of legal documents and a check representing her final financial obligation to the man who had discovered her. What Dorothy couldn't have known was that Snider had spent weeks planning for this meeting. His apartment had been transformed into a shrine to their relationship, with photographs of Dorothy covering every surface, and her Playboy magazines arranged like religious texts. He had purchased the shotgun days earlier and had been practicing what he would say to her, rehearsing scenarios that ranged from romantic reconciliation to violent revenge. The exact details of what happened in that apartment may never be fully known, but the evidence suggests that Snider initially attempted to persuade Dorothy to return to him. When that failed, when she made it clear that her decision was final, and that she was building a new life with another man, something inside him snapped completely. The coroner's report would later indicate that Dorothy had been sexually assaulted before being shot, a final act of possession and control by a man who could not accept that she had the right to choose her own life. The positioning of her body suggested that Snider had spent time with her corpse before turning the gun on himself, a grotesque finale to an obsession that had consumed his identity. The murder-suicide shocked Hollywood and made international headlines. Dorothy Stratten, the golden girl who had seemed to embody every American dream, was dead at 20 years old. The public mourned the loss of beauty and potential, but few understood the deeper tragedy. That a young woman's desire for love and security had made her vulnerable to a predator who had systematically destroyed everything she had tried to build. Peter Bogdanovich was devastated by the loss. He would later write a book about Dorothy, describing her as the most remarkable person he had ever known, and expressing his belief that she would have become one of the great actresses of her generation. He never fully recovered from her death, and his subsequent films were haunted by her memory. Hugh Hefner and the Playboy organization faced intense scrutiny in the aftermath of Dorothy's murder. Critics argued that the magazine's culture of exploitation had created the conditions for her tragedy, while defenders maintained that Playboy had simply provided opportunities that Dorothy had chosen to pursue. Were Dorothy's final decisions acts of courage in trying to build an independent life, or acts of naive trust in believing that someone who had already demonstrated his capacity for cruelty would respect her choices? The question haunted everyone who had known her, and revealed the complex dynamics of abuse, fame, and the particular vulnerabilities of young women in an industry built on their objectification. The memorial service for Dorothy Stratten was held on a perfect Los Angeles morning, the kind of day that made the city's promises of dreams come true seem almost believable. Hundreds of mourners gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had become, in death, even more famous than she had been in life. The guest list read like a who's who of Hollywood royalty, but missing from the crowd were many of the industry executives who had profited from her beauty and done nothing to protect her when she needed help. Peter Bogdanovich delivered a eulogy that revealed the Dorothy most people had never known. The young woman who wrote poetry, who worried about her family's financial security, who dreamed of being remembered for her kindness rather than her centerfolds. He spoke of her intelligence, her humor, and her extraordinary capacity for love, even toward those who had hurt her. The media coverage of Dorothy's death was extensive, but often focused on the salacious details rather than the deeper questions her murder raised about an industry that consumed young women. Headlines screamed about the Playboy murder and the fatal attraction that had ended in tragedy, but few publications examined the systemic issues that had made Dorothy vulnerable to exploitation. In the weeks following her death, disturbing details emerged about the final months of Dorothy's life. Friends came forward with stories about her fears, her attempts to seek help, and the inadequate response from law enforcement when she had reported Snider's threatening behavior. The police had treated her concerns as a domestic dispute rather than recognizing the escalating danger she faced. Private investigators hired by Dorothy's family uncovered evidence that Snider had been planning violence for weeks before the murder. His apartment contained detailed notes about Dorothy's schedule, photographs of her new home with Bogdanovich, and writings that revealed the depth of his obsession and rage. The materials suggested a man who had crossed the line from jealousy into dangerous delusion. The most chilling discovery was a series of tape recordings Snider had made in the days before the murder. Speaking to himself, he outlined various scenarios for getting Dorothy back, ranging from kidnapping to murder-suicide. The recordings revealed a man who saw Dorothy not as an independent person with her own rights and desires, but as property that had been stolen from him. Questions also emerged about the role of others in Dorothy's tragedy. Why had no one in the entertainment industry taken stronger action to protect her? Why had the police been so dismissive of her reports about Snider's behavior? Why had Playboy, which profited enormously from her image, provided so little support when she faced genuine danger? Some investigators and journalists suggested that Dorothy's murder was not simply a crime of passion, but the result of a culture that systematically devalued the lives and safety of women in the entertainment industry. They pointed to other cases of young actresses and models who had been exploited, abused, or killed by men who felt entitled to control them. Hugh Hefner responded to the criticism by instituting new security measures at Playboy and establishing a foundation to support women in crisis situations. But critics argued that these were cosmetic changes that did nothing to address the fundamental power dynamics that made women vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. The legal aftermath of Dorothy's death was complicated by the fact that both victim and perpetrator were dead. Snider's estate was bankrupt, leaving no resources for any civil judgment that might have been pursued. Dorothy's family received death benefits from her Playboy contracts, but no amount of money could compensate for their loss. More troubling were the attempts by some in the industry to revise history, portraying Dorothy as a troubled young woman who had made poor choices rather than acknowledging her as a victim of systematic abuse and exploitation. These narratives suggested that she bore some responsibility for her own death, a cruel reversal that added insult to the injury of her murder. The impact of Dorothy's death reverberated through Hollywood for years. Some actresses and models came forward to share their own experiences with threatening fans, abusive managers, and inadequate protection from studios and agencies. Others remained silent, fearing that speaking out would damage their careers in an industry that valued beauty and compliance over safety and independence. Was Dorothy's death the inevitable result of a toxic culture? Or could it have been prevented if the right people had taken her fears seriously? The question divided those who had known her, with some arguing that her murder was a singular tragedy caused by one man's obsession, while others saw it as the predictable outcome of an industry that treated young women as disposable commodities. The official cause of Dorothy's death was listed as homicide by gunshot wound, but the deeper truth was more complex. She had been killed by an obsession that an entire culture had enabled, a system that profited from her vulnerability, and a society that valued her image more than her life. In death, Dorothy Stratten became something she had never been in life, a symbol. For some, she represented the American dream perverted, the innocent girl from Canada whose beauty had led her into a nightmare. For others, she embodied the particular dangers faced by women in an industry built on male fantasy and female exploitation. The photographs that had made her famous continued to circulate, but now they carried a different meaning. The innocent smile that had captivated millions was haunted by knowledge of how her story ended. The beauty that had seemed so joyful and free was revealed as having been trapped, controlled, and ultimately destroyed by the very system that had celebrated it. Years later, when true crime documentaries and Hollywood retrospectives revisited Dorothy's story, they would struggle with the same questions that had emerged immediately after her death. Was she a victim of extraordinary circumstances or representative of something much more systematic and sinister? What hidden secrets about the entertainment industry's treatment of young women might still remain untold? Behind the glamorous facades and public relations campaigns, Dorothy's story suggested that for every success story celebrated in the media, there might be countless others whose dreams had turned to nightmares, whose trust had been betrayed, and whose voices had been silenced before they could tell their truth. The legacy of Dorothy Ruth Stratten lives on not just in the magazine pages where her image remains frozen in time, but in the questions her death raised about power, exploitation, and the true cost of fame in an industry that continues to consume young women while offering them little protection from the predators it attracts. Her story serves as a reminder that behind every perfect image, there is a human being with dreams, fears, and vulnerabilities that should be protected rather than exploited. In the end, Dorothy Stratten was not just the most beautiful woman in America. She was a young person who deserved to live, to grow, to make her own choices, and to find the love and security she had always sought. The tragedy is not just that she died so young, but that so few of the people who profited from her beauty ever truly saw her as anything more than the fantasy they had helped create. In remembering Dorothy Stratten, we must remember not just what she represented, but who she actually was. And we must ask ourselves what we have learned from her story about protecting the vulnerable in a world that too often values image over humanity.